more minutes. See some friendly faces and names entering the group. Okay. All right. So I'll go ahead and get us started with setting the stage. So this week, the Pentagon announced that the ISIS leader that was responsible for planning the 2021 attack on the Kabul airport that killed 13 U.S. service members has been killed by the Taliban. So that this occurred and was such a significant part of our news cycle really underscores the importance of what we're talking about today. My name is Gina Ligon. I'm the Director of Insight, which is the Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence for Terrorism Prevention and Counterterrorism Research. And a huge thrust of our work is the examination of the leaders of the groups that pose the most risk to the United States homeland, as well as our people and facilities abroad. Today, I'm actually here at one of our partners in the Insight Consortium, George Washington's Program on Extremism, where DHS-funded work is led by Seamus Hughes. Seamus Hughes, his ISIS Virtual Entrepreneurship Board is behind me. I'm actually in his office today. And he has been a great partner and doing work about how these leaders actually inspire homegrown violent extremists here in the United States. One of their incredible researchers, Andrew Mines, actually has a new book with Amir Jadoon out on ISIS Khorasan, about their alliances and rivalries. And this panel came from his brainchild, in that he really wanted to get what he called the best leadership experts around to be able to share their newest research that may not have even hit the books yet, or the journal articles, and to be able to have this kind of facilitated discussion about some of the applied implications associated with leadership work. And so here they are. My job is to introduce them and to be able to set the stage for them, give a little bit of logistics, and then get out of the way so you can hear from them. And so in order of events today, I'll go ahead and give you the roadmap of where we're going. So this is about an hour-long panel of each of these experts speaking about their latest work. They all have different types of expertise, which we're really excited about. At the end, I'll take moderator's prerogative and ask some of the first few questions, but I also encourage this audience to submit questions. And you can use this using the chat function on your Zoom link that you're on. And so at that point, I can ask those questions for you. So you can either direct it to a specific expert or to the whole panel, and I will work to moderate that as effectively as I can. At the end of this, there will be a recording available, as well as the resources that any of the experts reference during their talk. So each of them has new books, new journal articles, new work that they want to share with this audience. And so we will make that available to you at the end of this particular event today. So before we get going on introducing the panelists, I wanted to take a bit of time to set the stage about the research in this area. So I've studied terrorist leaders for 20 years this April. It's my 20th year of first looking at using leader analysis to study my first, what I would call top management team of a Salafi jihadist organization. And so I've looked at all gamuts since. I've looked at domestic violent extremist leaders, as well as issue-specific leaders, as well as nation-state leaders, to try to understand what are some of the differences that predict performance in these individuals. What I found is across at least violent ideological groups is that a lot of them have more in common than not, where there are individual differences, that leaders of domestic violent extremist groups use a lot of the same tactics and decision-making strategies as leaders of international foreign terrorist organizations, but they do have different operating constraints. And so that's where you get to really see some of the differences in performance, which I'm excited about our panel talking about today, particularly when you start narrowing down to a given region or a given type of ideology. You can really get some specificity around what it means to be one of these leaders. So just historically to review some of Jake Shapiro's first work on the constraints of operational security versus being able to share vision and ideological goals are something that these leaders have to balance in all violent ideological groups. I think Martha Crenshaw and Sam Hunter's work on leading for innovation, particularly malevolent innovation, and what types of leaders in this space are able to actually inspire the difficult work that's associated with generating a novel attack or a novel fundraising strategy, or even a novel organizational structure, which is what we're seeing right now. So this, combined with the U.S. government's continued policy of capture and kill for leaders of groups that they perceive are to be the highest risk to the homeland or people and facilities associated with the United States overseas, really makes this topic timely and important. And so with that, I wanted to turn it over to our experts. And so order of events today, you can think of it, we're going alphabetically. What we'll have first is we'll have Dr. Hassan Abbas, who's going to talk a bit about his newest book, I'm hopeful for, which is The Return of the Taliban, Afghanistan's After the Americans Left. If you didn't get to see it, it was just reviewed by the Times of London. It's getting incredible academic reviews as well as practitioner reviews, and hopefully it will be available in the United States this month. It's already been released abroad. But one of the things about his expertise, he's at the National Defense University here in DC, and his research focus is about building narratives to counter both political and religious extremism. But he also does rule of law reforms and research on that in developing states. So just an incredibly well-versed scholar in this particular domain. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Abbas to be able to share his thoughts on what it means for terrorism leadership, academic work, and what we should be thinking about today. Dr. Abbas?
Thank you so much. I'm truly honored by this opportunity, and especially to be among these very learned and accomplished scholars who are in this panel. I'll briefly talk about the range of different techniques and the range of leadership styles that we are seeing in South Asia today in the militancy or the jihadist world, but especially in reference to Taliban. But before that, I'll say that if you look at all the groups, if I have to just briefly categorize, al-Qaeda is in South Asia, it is weak, but it is weak in terms of its organizational structures, and also because there is no big name leader which is aligned or associated with al-Qaeda today. So the profiles or the inverted commas charisma, so-called charisma associated with these names make a huge difference. Al-Qaeda is weak because there is no big name which is leading al-Qaeda at this moment, but their presence through social media is keeping it alive. They are coming up with new magazines, actually. Moved to ISK, there's an excellent new book that has come out by one of the organizers of this conference, and Amelia Jadoon and reminds on ISK. We know that ISK remains somewhat of a puzzle. We know that it is a resilient group, Islamic State of Khorasan. Many a times people thought in 2018, 2019, that since it came into existence in 2015, that it is a dead group. But then again, whenever the opportunity arises, ISK is up on front, and there's a different leadership model. Their leaders are not as well known, or their speeches and their big statements are not widely available. But there's something about ISK in that region which is giving it the capacity to be resilient, which is the idea of caliphate. And it is more dangerous in the sense that militants and extremists are using it than it is still widely known. In one of my interviews for this recent book on the return of the Taliban, when I asked, this was one of the ideologues of Afghan Taliban, when I asked him what we ask often in US in our own language or lingo, what keeps you alive at night? What keeps you up at night? And I framed it exactly like this. This was an interview happening in Pakistan. And this is the Afghan Taliban ideologue. And he said, it is the idea of caliphate, the way ISK is using it. Because he said, our young folks are asking this question that the new state that Taliban is building, what is our governance model? And he said, because more is known about the ISIS or ISK model, people are really energized by that because they think of a new state which will be just, which every good thing that you associate with it. And he said, now they ask us, how are Taliban different? So this idea is even having an impact. So at times, charismatic leadership works. At times, these ideas, which are in line with the times that you are living in, that happens. Now I come to the main point on Afghan Taliban and Pakistani Taliban. Again, different models. In Afghan Taliban, who are now, for all practical purposes, in power, they are the de facto rulers. The pattern has changed from Mullah Omar, who was a militant leader because he had done well in the field and he had taken some powerful decisions at the spur of the moment. For example, going after some of the Mujahideen, Afghan Jihad era leaders at that time, and he was seen as very aggressive, very powerful, who took decision on the ground, and he had no religious credentials per se. He had never gone into any madrasa. So he had led the Taliban over last, from 1995 to till the time of his death in 2013. But the new leader, current leader, Mullah Haibatullah in Kandahar, who's all powerful, all his credentials are purely religious credentials. He's not seen as a battlefield commander, but his education in a madrasa, and he's called, in a sense, religious Sheikh al-Hadith, which means he is really into the theological academic side of things. He had used to run a major madrasa in Quetta, Pakistan, close to that area. So it's very interesting how Afghan Taliban's leadership style, not leadership style, the profile of the leadership has changed in a tremendous fashion. And those who are in Kabul, Mullah Sirajuddin Haqqani, Mullah Yaqub, son of Mullah Omar, and many others, they are kind of more pragmatic. It's very interesting. And I'll then move on to Pakistani Taliban. But one last thing, all the speeches, and I was looking at for my this book, trying to categorize these speeches that are coming out of Kabul from these cabinet ministers, defense minister, interior minister, all the others, are quite, for the lack of any other word, secular in orientation. They talk about governance, they talk about a banking system, they talk about good governance, they talk about aid, they talk about why West is not recognizing us, legal issues, political issues. Whereas in Kandahar, the really seat of power, all the statements that come out are a Sharia state. We have done a big favor to the Islamic Ummah. We want to build a new model, which is according to Islam. So this is, and the real power at this moment is in the hands of Kandaharis in Afghan Taliban. So that's another interesting model. Last but not the least, with my probably 2 minutes left in my quota, which is on Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. Extremely deadly group. If you ask me which is the deadliest group in South Asia today, which has a capability to not only create havoc, but also potentially conduct attacks elsewhere in the region at least, is Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. And why I say this is because this is the group which has borrowed from so many smaller militant groups, some which were focused on Kashmir, others which were focused with ethnically inspired. And that is the group which has now started conducting attacks in Pakistan. And the most unique thing about it is they have a well-known leader who's an acknowledged, accepted leader of Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or TTP, because he belongs to the most important tribe in that area, which is Mahsoods. So, and this will come up later on as well. In some areas, it is extremely important what is the tribe of the leader, not his academic credentials, I'm saying theological credentials or anything else, or battlefield experience even. His tribe makes the huge difference. And why TTP is dangerous is, and this is a different model than everyone else's, they are making a case, they have stopped conducting terrorist attacks targeting people, ordinary people, marketplace. They are only attacking security forces. And they are trying to become a political group. These are more dangerous groups because it means they are very strategic in their thinking. They know what went against them, why the military in Pakistan had gone after them, why the military had received support. So they're constantly thinking that last time we received a pushback and they were pushed out of Pakistan into Afghanistan at that time. They don't want that to be repeated. They want to expand their space and want to look good. And in many cases, like in ISK and others who are more media creations is not the right word. What I want to say is they're benefiting hugely from their social media presence. TTP is more local. They have kept their organization structure very, very secret. And I'll close with this one anecdote. I was talking to a business leader in Peshawar through a friend. And I asked them about how is the new TTP and this new reign of terror is different from what happened previously. And he said, previously, 7 years ago, if there was a kidnapping or there was harassment and blackmail, we knew who is the head of TTP in District X, and we would pick up a phone and we'll call them. Within 1 hour, we could know who to reach out to if we have to negotiate about a kidnapping case. He said, now there's a new leadership. They've kept their structure secret. We don't know who's who. So if a kidnapping or kidnapping for ransom happens or some other terrible incident happens and we want to reach out, they have kept their security, their structure and their names so secret we don't know who to reach out to. So that's where I will close. I know there's no one nugget or one theme that I can give you, but I thought this kind of an overall view will give us an idea of how it looks like in South Asia. Back to you.
Thank you so much. Honestly, we've had questions pop up in the Q&A based on what you just shared. I wrote down 3 questions, so I think we're all very excited to hear more from you during the Q&A at the end of this. But I think next we'll move on to Dr. Tricia Bacon. She's an associate professor at American University School of Public Affairs. She actually directs the Policy Anti-Terrorism Hub, which is a super cool name of her research group there. She is the author of a newly released book that I know Austin and I consumed voraciously when it came out, Terror in Transition, Leadership and Succession in Terrorist Organizations. But she also wrote the book about why terrorist organizations form international alliances, which again reflects her deep expertise in terrorist decision-making, but also how it relates to U.S. policy as it's associated with any kind of deterrent strategies we take or this capture and kill strategy that we take as a U.S. government. So I'm very excited to hear what Tricia is going to share with us, because I think her work on terrorist leadership typologies and what succession planning looks like and just deep expertise about cases is incredibly important to add some color to this conversation. So Dr. Bacon, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. That's a very kind introduction. And I'm also very glad to be here with this panel of people today. This is just an exceptional group. And I know the other panelists are giving us sort of different regional reviews that it will be very illustrative, I'm sure. And I think what I'm going to do is sort of a lightning round of the typology that Gina just alluded to in the new book that Liz Grimm and I had recently come out. And basically sort of our conceit on this was to try to understand leaders of terrorist organizations in sort of a consistent way of thinking about the types that they are. And so we asked these 3 questions about both founders and then the successors that come from these organizations, and whether we could then identify different types of successors based on this. So sort of the core argument that we make is that founders are the baseline. They're the foundation of the organizations that they form. And in so doing, they establish sort of 2 critical pillars. They establish why the organization exists, right? Why fight, why kill, why die? And they establish how to pursue the group's political aims, how to mobilize resources, what kind of tactics to use, and sort of this sort of basic idea of the how and why. That founders are creating this foundation with varying degrees of sort of rigidity or flexibility, depending in part on their sort of orientation, as well as how long they are able to be the founder of an organization. So with this idea that you have founders, then when you experience succession in organizations, in particular, we looked at religious terrorist organizations. with the idea that in these kinds of organizations, leadership plays a perhaps outsized role as it does compared to some other types of organizations. And so from there, what essentially the choice that's facing successors is how much to vary from the founder's foundation. Essentially, how much change to undertake to this core how and why established by the founder. And the idea is you can take basic sort of small incremental changes that sort of evolve a group slowly over time based on circumstances, based on counterterrorism pressure, or take these much bigger discontinuous changes, introduce new tactics, start a political party, participate in elections even, sort of the array of tactics, not just violent tactics, as well as maybe moving from having front businesses to kidnapping and really changing how you mobilize resources or how you recruit. So this is kind of the core question facing successors. Often founders have a lot of legitimacy in their organizations. They are why people join. They are who sort of set the tone. So these kinds of changes are pretty significant questions for successors. And with this idea, essentially we propose that there's 5 types of successors. And the types are based on how much change the leader undertakes to either the how and the why or both. So the idea of a caretaker is essentially they continue the pathway set by a founder. They're not making major changes to an organization. And often they're going to have forms of inherited legitimacy that essentially they depend on the founder for their legitimacy. So they're reluctant to make significant changes. And then we propose the idea of a fixer, which are leaders who are keeping the ideology, the goals the same, but they're making changes to the tactics, making changes to the resource mobilization. And then for signalers, they're keeping the tactics generally the same, but they're making larger sort of political or ideological changes. And the big one that came up in groups we looked at was affiliations with al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, sort of this shift in the framing of an organization. And then we have visionaries. And these are kind of the game changer leaders. These are the ones who are changing both the tactics and resource mobilization of a group and the ideology, sort of political framing of an organization. But we also wanted to acknowledge that leaders are not necessarily the end all be all for these organizations. Sometimes because of circumstances, personality, counterterrorism pressure, leaders are not going to be the people driving changes in an organization. And for those types of leaders, we call them figureheads, where essentially they are not the locus of decision-making in the organization. And one of the things we want to sort of bring to this is the idea that none of these types are effective or ineffective inherently. And a lot of the debates within the leadership sort of discussions about leaders in these organizations is about whether a leader was effective or not. And people use very different criteria to assess that. People I'll think very highly of will make polar opposite arguments about the same leader. And it's often because we're using different criteria. So our argument is that none of these types are inherently necessarily make a person an effective leader, but you can have an effective caretaker and an ineffective caretaker, or an effective visionary or an ineffective visionary. So it gives sort of a framework to assess effectiveness that provides maybe a degree of continuity that hasn't really existed in a lot of the discussions to date. And then in the book, we have 4 case studies that I won't go into in this discussion. But we look at 4 organizations in depth that have variation in geographical area, duration of the fixer, chronologically, the religious orientation of the groups. And we look to see whether these typologies really capture the leadership dynamics. And each one had a very different leadership sort of trajectory. But overall, we do see that these types consistently emerged in these 4 organizations that we looked at in depth. But in addition to that, we sought to identify essentially the religious terrorist organizations that had had at least one round of leadership succession. So it had to be an organization who actually had a religious ideology, not just people from the same religion, and that who had experienced at least one change from a founder to a successor, and then sort of a baseline minimum of the number of attacks that they had conducted to sort of qualify. And we did have to drop a couple of organizations because there simply wasn't enough information. But we went back about 100 years to develop our sample of 33 organizations. And one of the interesting things that we found is essentially there's a degree of conservatism between in the succession process from a founder to the first successor. Most of the time when you lose a founder, you're going to see a caretaker emerge as the next type of leader. which makes some sense given how sort of larger than life founders tend to be. But if you are going to see change, the main change is going to be tactical, that groups are going to change their tactics or the way that they're mobilizing resources in that initial succession. And probably not surprisingly to anyone in this event, most of the time founders are killed. That is the main sort of trajectory that we see in terms of why founders are no longer leading the organization. In sort of the rare cases where they step down, as you might expect, we're going to see caretakers. They only step down if they know someone's going to continue their legacy. But by and large, no matter how they're killed, the most likely way that we're going to see, most likely type we're going to see is a caretaker emerging. And interestingly, when we looked beyond just that first line of succession to all of the succession that we looked at, it was 38 founders because a couple organizations had multiple founders and about 112 successors. The vast majority of the time, 65% of the time, you're going to see the emergence of a caretaker or a fixer. So most of the time, leadership succession is not producing necessarily major change in these organizations. But I think that one of the surprising things was how often we did see visionaries. They were about 19% of the time. And what we saw is that they were really sort of polarizing leaders, meaning that they often came into organizations that were weakened and they either really revitalized those organizations or essentially they cracked them in half. Like it was too much internal discord. There was too much consternation about the changes they were making. So it was a particularly volatile type of leader. And about 10% of the time, we saw that there were signalers who changed the framing and ideology, but not the tactics. But it was more likely if you were going to make that change, you're going to change both the resource mobilization tactics and ideology. And I think the biggest surprise for us was how relatively rare figureheads were, about 7% of the time. And given, as Gina alluded to, the prominence of capturing and killing leaders over especially the last 22 years, I think we expected there to be more figureheads, more people who sort of abdicated an ongoing role in the organization so that they could survive to lead it. But it does suggest that there's something about people who arise into this role, that they are sort of intent on being the decision makers once they are in that position. And I would just sort of conclude by talking about the counterterrorism implication for this. I mean, capturing and killing leaders in particular has been a major tactic, but that is going to have to change. If we are not investing the same levels of intelligence and counterterrorism resources towards tracking groups, we're not going to have the information to eliminate leaders. So there's probably going to be a more selective approach undertaken to leadership decapitation going forward. And there was maybe the luxury of being able to capture and kill frequently when there was a lot of attention. But now I think we're going to be in a situation where there's going to have to be sort of more assessment of which leaders merit it or which groups present enough threat to undertake those efforts. And I think one of the things that we would propose is there's a way to assess a leader in an organization. Is he an effective type of the type he is? And is the type that he is the type that an organization actually needs? And one of the things that we found repeatedly is that groups don't always get the leaders they need, right? Sometimes you have this mismatch between where an organization is and what kind of leader it has. You may need dynamic change and then you get a caretaker, right? You may need continuity and you get a visionary. So we're hoping that this will provide some framework that can help to inform at least leadership decapitation decisions going forward in the sort of new phase of counterterrorism that the US government is in. So with that, I don't want to take any more than my time because I definitely want to hear from Austin and Craig, and I will pass it back.
Great. And we actually got a question while you were speaking about recent decapitation events of ISIS leaders in Syria. So hopefully we can get to your thoughts on that during the Q&A because it's directly related to your taxonomy and your model, and would be really great to hear your thoughts. Next, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Austin Doctor. So Austin is from Omaha, Nebraska. He is now anyway. He lives there because he is part of the Insight Center. He's our director of counterterrorism initiatives, research initiatives, and he's a political scientist in the University of Nebraska, Omaha Poli-Sci department. He's also part of the Modern War Institute at West Point, And he's also a big contributor to the Nexus projects here at Program on Extremism, which I think some of his remarks will touch on today. What I'm really excited about with Austin's work is that he's been doing some really large and quantitative studies about leadership efficacy and different types of effectiveness. So to Trisha's point, thinking about different types of outcomes and what we mean by effective leaders, and just published something in Terrorism and Political Violence on that front about different militant leaders' backgrounds with military combat and training and how that predicted different levels of lethality. So excited to hear from him on that, as well as some of his research about regional leadership in the AFRICOM area of operations. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Doctor.
Okay, thanks, Gina. Good afternoon, everyone who's joined us online for this discussion. I appreciate the program, appreciate our team at Insight for organizing this event. It's great to be with my friends and colleagues on today's panel. As Gina mentioned, I serve as Director of Counterterrorism Research Initiatives at Insight. My work focuses and addresses militants and terrorism, both at home and abroad, with a focus on emerging threats. As it relates to our discussion, and I think like all of my fellow panelists, I've spent my career up to this point working to better understand the global jihadist enterprise and the constellation of groups within it, including their leadership, their organizational structures, and their expansion into new or growth in different global theaters, including sub-Saharan Africa. Time is short, and so within that time, I really want to focus on the trajectory of al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Africa, with a pointed focus on those regional leadership dynamics. I've been fortunate to publish some of this work, as Gina alluded to, with the program's Nexus initiative, including a recent report that Trisha and I wrote on the implications of the raid that resulted in the death of Bilal al-Sudani earlier this year. I've got about 5 minutes or so. So within those five minutes, 3 quick points. One is that the Africa region remains a critical front in the global jihadist enterprise. Second is that leaders of local AQ, IS affiliates in Africa are mostly operating largely independently of any command or control from that central leadership, if we view them within that nested leadership structure. And that lends itself to what I want to be a third brief point, and that based off of that fact and based off conditions on the ground, I expect that leaders of local Islamic State and AQ affiliates in Africa, that they're going to tailor their narratives and largely their operations more narrowly to remain largely focused on local and regional issues or the near enemy. But, and this is with that big caveat, some will remain operationally capable of attacking U.S. interests and communities. So let me get to the first point. With regards to Salafi jihadism, we're continuing to see more growth in Africa than any other global region. And we should be wary, I think, of taking our eye off the ball, because that threat remains very real. And it's not just real, that challenge, that problem is getting worse. We are observing in real time a sustained surge of violence across the continent. A recent report from the Africa Center summarized this pretty well, demonstrating that violence linked to militant Islamist groups in the region has actually nearly doubled since 2019. And not only that, but that civilians, right, continue to bear a growing share of the brunt of this violence. Geographically, Africa is not a single country, it's a large place. So geographically within that, we're seeing this surge in violence being led by groups active in the Sahel, in the Horn, and we're still seeing a plateau, but significant activity coming out of the Lake Chad area. That said, right, regional jihadist networks obviously extend well beyond these concentrated areas and more broadly across the continent. Without a doubt, Africa is the epicenter of global jihadist activity. It's where the industry is having its greatest successes. 2 of the most dynamic Islamic State networks are based in Africa. Al-Qaeda's most successful affiliate, al-Shabaab, is in Somalia. And al-Qaeda's most brutal affiliate, the one most notorious right now in terms of numbers of civilian casualties, JNIM is in the Sahel. And so if these are the top performers, right, within the global jihadist enterprise worldwide, and they're largely concentrated far away from at least the believed position of their respective central leaderships. I think it's worth considering here how we think about the commanders of these regional affiliates and how they operate and make decisions within their more nested leadership structures. And this moves on to that second point, that I expect that leaders of local AQ, IS affiliates in Africa will continue to operate mostly independent of command and control from that central leadership. Some of this is because AQ and IS their core leaderships are having a tough year due to a high tempo and sustained tempo of leadership targeting operations with al-Zawahiri in July, Safe Baghdad in October. These groups have experienced additional sustained losses, right? It's still sort of at that next bottom layer at the highest echelons of their councils and leadership. And so in this phase of these groups' life cycles or this industry's life cycle, both al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, I think, will come to rely heavily on its top performers in regions outside of, say, Iraq and Syria for both credibility and for sustained effect. Under these conditions, there are far fewer opportunities for communication, for monitoring and enforcement. These are fundamental mechanisms of command and control. I really love how our mutual colleague, Jason Warner, puts this, and I think he's right in that he describes the affiliates in Africa, particularly with the Islamic State, largely operate and act as sovereign subordinates, where instead of control, central leadership offers some strategic and operational guidance and really respective to very particular subsets of affiliates, but co-branding and this connective tissue really mostly serves other functions, things like brand promotion, propaganda, financing and support, and really even the sort of endowment of doctrinally aligned legitimacy. And what this means is that to better understand and to more effectively anticipate the trajectories of these jihadist insurgencies in Africa, we have to weigh what we know about the central leadership, but focus on what we believe to be true of its local commanders. Their competencies, their biases, and even their personal visions for a localized jihad. And this, Lindsay, I'll conclude briefly so I can turn the mic over to my colleague. Third, and really on that point, is that we should expect leader narratives and activities by African affiliates that they will largely remain focused on local and regional issues. Now, I say that with the caveat that this is not an industry that has forgotten that far enemy of the West, but for operational, right, and localized reasons, will likely remain more focused on the near enemy, at least in the near term. They'll direct those both political and military actions against local governments and local communities in order to establish that sure foothold and even begin to expand their radius of influence, where narratives will be leader narratives, the why that Tricia mentioned, right, will be deeply rooted in locally held grievances. They will draw on for many of these groups they're going to draw on those generational ties to local communities. And I think we should expect to see for the groups that don't have those deep connections and levels of embeddedness that they may seek to artificially generate some kind of compliance through more extreme and severe forms of violence. Again, this is not to suggest that we should not remain vigilant to the threat of an over-horizon attack against the U.S. or that African Islamist groups won't work to inspire persons already living in the United States to conduct an attack. Some of these groups will maintain that capability. And just as an example, just a few years ago, we saw an operative of al-Shabaab being arrested in the Philippines, right, who was working to conduct a 9/11 style attack in the United States. We should not remove, right, this type of risk from our consideration, but also weigh it with the knowledge or expectation that these groups will predominantly have an operational focus that's closer to their areas of operation. Again, this is an issue that hasn't gone away, but will be more centered locally. To wrap it up, let me close by saying that I'm grateful for a chance to have what I think is still a very important and timely topic. And with regards to global jihad, the United States isn't out of the woods. We continue to see credible risks in the forms of homegrown violent extremists, plans for over-the-horizon attacks, and a more entrenched and deeply entrenched expansion in key global regions like Africa. Thanks so much. Look forward to our discussion and Q&A.
Great. We already got a question in the chat as well for you, Austin, about implications of state actors in Africa, particularly some of China's industrial ambitions, as well as, I would add, Russia's sort of non-state or asymmetric ambitions there. So maybe we can ask that in the Q&A just for you to start thinking about. Our final panelist is Dr. Craig Whiteside. Craig Whiteside is a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College's resident program at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. His research, if you followed him, has really been focused on some of the application associated with profiling these types of leaders, and specifically his book, The ISIS Reader, that was a Oxford University Press released in 2020, really tried to help us understand how leaders in that particular group thought about military doctrine, and using his training and background. He's a former Army officer as well, to be able to understand and help people like us, civilians, who may not have the same kind of training he does, to understand the implications of their military doctrine for their leadership decision making. Craig also has a BS from West Point, and he's recently published an article in Studies of Conflict and Terrorism he's going to talk a bit about, which is really about the political consolidation of the Islamic State prior to the Caliphate. I'm excited to hear Craig today close us out with our panelists. He's going to talk about jihadist leadership, specifically in Iraq and Syria. So with that, Dr. Whiteside, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And let's see if I can, oops. All right, sorry, I'm at the, okay. Can you see my slides all right? Yep, okay. Great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with a lot of really smart folks. And I'll remind you now, I'm a civilian again. So that's just a jab at you. I'll be talking about specifically Islamic State's leadership, but I'd like to tie into a lot of what's already been talked about as best I can, pulling up Till and Charlie. Here's just some of the key points, but I'll talk about some of the motivations here. A lot of the focus, as Tricia pointed out, on leadership and leadership succession in these militant groups, but particularly religious ones that we're talking about today, has largely been, it starts with the assessment of a tactic, i.e. leader targeting, and then it backs into leadership. And there's a clear bias there that I think has tainted the discussions. And I won't speak for Tricia, but I think those are some of the allusions she was making. I think there's been a new focus, Gina's and Austin's recent work, but Tricia's book that she just talked about, and Brock Mendelsohn as well, about importance of founders, how succession is actually done, what are the types of leaders are actually chosen, that is more centric to the organization. And I think a little bit, it's much more empathetic to how they think about surviving and achieving their political objectives. And that, as Austin said earlier, it's quite difficult in an environment of very stringent, pervasive leadership targeting that's going on now. And ISIS has lost two of its top leader in the last year, as well as many mid-level leaders, which is really normal for them. So that's the pertinence of what we're talking about today. And I'll try to tie this back at the end. Again, something that Tricia discussed, but the study of militant leadership, particularly in the leadership targeting and then assessing how that has resulted in the survival or the death of groups, has started with a lot of assumptions that I think, again, have been backward engineered from leader targeting. And I think a lot of them are questionable. And I've thrown off a lot of these that I think, when I look at Islamic State, they don't look like any of these assumptions. And that's problematic when they're a critical case. And they're the group that I think the United States has done more leader targeting at all levels for the better part of 2 decades. So the fact that these assumptions that underpin a lot of the leader targeting literature and how we think about militant leadership is problematic. not to poke anyone, as Tricia said earlier. I'll just focus on a couple that we'll see in the ISIS case study that I'll lay out in rapid speed, but it's one that leaders are charismatic. And from a Weberian perspective, charisma is more about the relationship between followers and leaders. It is not whether they give lots of speeches, and it's not whether they are well received when they give those speeches, or if they're boring speeches, right? That is a fundamental misunderstanding that's kind of tainting our perspective to date. The other one is transformational leadership is often double or used as a synonym for charismatic leaders, but that's not the same. These are two different understandings. One's more about legitimacy, and the other is more about the intents of what the leader is trying to achieve in the organization. And Tricia covered that very well about in her typology with her co-author of what are these leaders being picked by the organization at large to do. So that's one thing. And then lastly is that there's disincentives to institutionalization, right? Or routinizing the organization into a structure and a hierarchy. But the Islamic State, I could show you chart after chart after chart of their organizational charts in detail that go back to 2005 that belie that assumption that these groups are trying to do this at the same time. I think everyone understands who this is. You know, this is the founder of the group. He was charismatic. He set the agenda. He was transformative for the movement in the direction that this part of the movement, of the larger movement, kind of went in. And I think we understand a lot about that. But then, as Tricia pointed out earlier, succession of that founder is crucial. And it's clear from documents that we've seen that Islamic State was thinking about this both before and during the transition period of their leader, and wrote a very long piece about one, why they need to create an Islamic State in Iraq, but two, how do they think about leadership? Who's going to lead that state? And how do they choose the leader? And they've really followed this almost directly since. So this shows you the intentionality that goes into this. I would just say that the only thing that's missing from here that Islamic State has done, and I'll hit that in the next slides, is there's no mention here that they have to be related to the Quraysh tribe. And in this particular document, nor were caliphs in the early caliphate period of early Islam or later had to have that tie as well. So they've made that up. They've modified and innovated in that way for a particular reason that I'll try to highlight here. His successor, which you can read as a case study in Tricia's book, Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, was a longtime veteran, but no one knew who he was. Going back to Hassan's point, Dr. Abbas's point earlier about we don't know who these leaders are. He was anonymized, if you will, even though he was well known within the organization. That was done for security reasons, but also for the transition reasons that Tricia talked about. He can't be bigger than the founder, so don't try. He can't be bigger than the organization, because the other thing the Islamic State did was they created an Islamic State. The organ is a state project, now an official state project, and married it with the succession and the selection of a non-charismatic leader, right? This is a person who did not have, as an anonymous figure, the emotional ties to the followers that the founder had. And that was purposeful, as we argue, because as we look into the future, you can see other leaders who have become famous now and have been called charismatic by many analysts, and yet that is, I think, a misunderstanding. Abu Bakr, as he was known, didn't give a speech for his first 2 years, right? That's counter to what we understand as charismatic leaders communicating to the community. He was more of the caretaker that she mentions. He has these religious credentials that Dr. Abbas talks about that are really important. And he has the Quraysh tie that Abu Umar also had. And he's also got additional ties, the Husseini tie that Abu Umar had as well. So he's really following in the exact kind of footsteps as Abu Omar. And there's, certainly he makes decisions that change the trajectory of this organization. But what the group when the group selected them, they wanted him to kind of continue the ideology and the implementation of a future Islamic State as directed by the founder, with very little changes, both in tactics and who the targets are, the types of things we focus on. His successor, al-Mawla, again, none of these are fighters, commanders, they're political religious leaders, and he has all of the same characteristics of his two predecessors, not the founder. And I'd also add, never gave a speech in his entire, and was anonymous until the end, where certain hypotheses about who he were revealed. And then the one who was killed earlier this year, the one that was killed more recently, Abu Hassan, definitely first generation, but not a lot known for the tribal affiliation tied to Quraysh, even though they called him al-Hashimi, al-Qurayshi, and also not a warrior, coming out of the religious, but in this case, religious education. So what we know about the current leader is almost nothing. And his predecessor didn't give a speech. We have not heard from this one. He's anonymous. He has the religious tie that you can see and the lineage to Muhammad's tribe, the Prophet Muhammad's tribe. And we don't have a mention of the actual process, which is very unique. And the last thing I'll say about him, the current leader, that's very unique is his predecessor was killed not by Delta Force, but by local militants, which is the first time the leader succession has been instigated by someone that wasn't the U.S. High-tier military elements. So just to kind of cover here, when I look, my current project looks at the founding of Islamic State in 2006 and how they picked Abu Umar, the person that the United States for the longest time felt was not a real person, that was kind of an imaginary figure to make the group look Iraqi, as if an organization with interest and credibility would do so. The next one is the idea of creating a political leader that's different from the military leader, and that also happened in 2006. Roles for future research, I think, in this field, since that's a subtopic of our panel, is how do advisory panels, much like advisory systems to our president of the United States work, how do advisory systems to the leader of these militant groups function? In the Islamic States had a very high profile Shura Council delegated committee that's done so. What I find interesting is some of the themes that overlap with some of the topics that Tricia wrote about and talked about in hers were the idea of tapping into Weber for legitimacy. You can see that the founder had charismatic legitimacy from his followers that had to get translated somehow in another manner to his successors. And me and a co-author argue that largely that's done through the legal rational processing, that the Shura Council picked this person because they are the best candidate. And that is how it's described in the doctrine that's published in 2006. So they're following the rules. And this is much like an election process that we have, although obviously a non-democratic version. And then finally, they blend in aspects of what Weber calls traditional legitimacy, which is this Quraysh tribe that they made up as a requirement for all of their subsequent leaders, and doesn't have a lot of precedent, although it's considered to be, at least culturally, the best kind of tie because you're a descendant of the tribe or sub-tribe from Muhammad. And that's it. The interesting thing that I think we still haven't answered is how are affiliates, the type that Austin talked about, why are they following these unknown anonymous leaders that now have very limited engagement compared to 3 or 4 years ago? And Austin talked about that very well. And then the last thing I'll say is, how do you maintain this ties in with what Austin was talking about to finish up. How do you maintain leadership of an organization that is in a sustained down cycle or waning? We had predictions that ISIS would make a comeback in 2020, and yet this is what their current trajectory looks like, and it's still falling. So I'm sure 2023 numbers, even though they have fluctuations in different, in Africa per se, in all areas across the globe, the Islamic State is plummeting and still not hit bottom yet. And that's an important thing to think about, because the leaders have to manage expectations in this down cycle. And I think you can see even in their heartland of Iraq and Syria, it's all-time lows, and we haven't seen, for the first time since I think 2003, we have not seen a Ramadan offensive by either Islamic State affiliate or Islamic State actors in this particular country, which I think tells you, which says a lot, but it to me makes me think that the leadership is under unprecedented pressure from within the organization, and of course outside of the organization. And with that, I'll conclude.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions that have come in on the chat, so I'm going to first take the first one that came in from one of the Insight board members. So we have a government board filled with subject matter experts across the U.S. government who are focused on counterterrorism, and they were very eager for this panel. The question I would like to direct to all of you, and I think what I'd like to do in terms of order, if we could go for Dr. Abbas first, and just the same order of the speakers for this time, and then Dr. Bacon, Dr., and then Dr. Whiteside. So the question that we have is, when a new leader emerges in a jihadist movement, what characteristics should concern us the most? So when you all are looking at them and you're learning about a new leader, what are something that your research tells you is an important warning sign that this particular leader is going to be dangerous? Dr. Abbas?
Thank you so much. I'm immediately thinking of 4 or 5 of the major terrorist organizations in South Asia and in Pakistan and Afghanistan in particular. Especially, I'll name those. One was Lashkar-e-Taiba, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, Sipah-e-Sahaba. These were local terrorist groups which have survived, changed names so many times, and also provided recruitment to ISK, because there's no new recruitment that happens. It is often these militants and terrorists jumping from one group to the other, at times thinking which group is getting more funding. So that's the range of groups. And of course, Taliban and al-Qaeda I'm also looking at. I think, as I briefly hinted earlier, the most important thing will be in this case their ethnic background. Because in case of Taliban, and because as we often say, by no stretch of imagination, all Pashtuns are terrorists or extremists, and but all Taliban, in many cases, about 80 to 90% were from one ethnic background, although there are Punjabi Taliban, others as well. Their ethnic tribal connection. Because with that tribal connection, I'll just mention one tribe, Mahsud, M-E-H-S-U-D. And Mahsuds were historically known to be rebellious, to be those who defied order. They were not necessarily terrorists, but they were the ones who were leading some of the revolutionary radical movements historically. So anyone, because the name is associated with those who are seen as brave, courageous, historically rooted. So when someone becomes a leader from that tribe, automatically that tribe's loyalty is there. That's why it is important. So tribal connection in case of South Asia, for sure. History of participation in militancy, we know that from al-Qaeda and others, the modern day terrorist groups are in some shape or form all a byproduct of Afghan jihad of 1980s, whether it was Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, whether it was Malaysia. It was all those jihadis who had fought in Afghanistan who went back home, many of them, and started their own organizations. I shudder to think what will be the impact of this new ISIS in Iraq. They've been pushed out largely, but Syria, exactly what we had seen in Afghan Jihad in 1980s, we now know the result. What ISIS has done to this field, we will know 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and we are starting seeing all this. So the history of participation in militancy, because that's how the names become prominent within their own sphere. Thirdly, access to resources. In 1990s and even later on as well, in South Asia, many of the militant terrorist groups in Pakistan, for example, would pick a group based on which group is in the good books of the Pakistani intelligence. Because at that time, Pakistani intelligence was in some cases supporting some of the militant groups in Kashmir to fight against India for their own reasons, all politics, that is aside. But people would pick up a group based on, okay, if I'm part of a militant group which has a good relationship with the state infrastructure, so I'm not going to be pursued by the state. So that's also another thing. Which are the leaders which had linkages with the state establishment or state infrastructure? And last but not the least, charisma, of course, matters. That's pretty well known. And the last and not the least is, of course, the religious credentials. And that is tricky. We don't know always in these modern militant groups, those who claim to be Muslim, in there, necessarily it is not important that they have a religious credential or religious degree. People don't go out for that. Bin Laden was able to do so much damage, and he would issue fatwas, and he had no religious degree. Because ordinary people had no idea. They saw him wearing a certain turban and a certain dress code, and they said, oh, he must have religious credentials. But in the eyes of the people, this fact that whether somebody has religious credentials or not is important. So if from a counterterrorism point of view, my last point, and I'll leave it at that, if I find a person who's newly emerging leader, and if I as a state or as an individual, as a law enforcement, as a political leader, I know that this Mr. X lacks religious credentials, I would use social media. I would use the counter narrative by exposing that this person actually is not well rooted into Islamic ideology, and by that the ordinary people will think, oh, that means he's a politician. He has political radical agenda, and he's using religion for these purposes. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent counter messaging strategies with all of those that you just shared. Dr. Bacon.
Sure. I think the first thing I would say is that one of the things that I've experienced, even when I was in the intelligence community, is there's a fair degree of surprise that can happen in succession processes. You know, us knowing Zawahiri would be bin Laden's successor is sort of the exception. And as Craig alluded to, there's successors who we don't know at all, who sometimes can emerge as really dynamic leaders, and then others who we never really know anything about. And I think one of our core sort of thesis of the book is that one of the things we can more systematically do is assess what kind of leader exists and how that fits with the organization's circumstances. So that's, kind of the core argument that I've already made. I think that especially in environments where you don't maybe know a lot about their credentials. And one of the things that we found that was very interesting is people changed as leaders over time. Zawahiri was a very different type of leader when he was the head of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad as when he was the leader of al-Qaeda, in terms of how he met, even though his personality didn't change, sort of how he led did change. So I think that's one of our sort of main things that we're pointing to with this work. And then I have something that's sort of on the other side of things, which is I think one of the things to look at is how excited and how mobilized supporters and members are by an individual. And that may or may not be related to specific characteristics about them that are easy to know, but you can see when a leader has sort of this activating effect on the rank and file and on supporters. And I think that's a really important sort of marker to note of a leader who has the potential to really be dynamic and make the organization grow and become a threat, again, even if it wasn't at the time.
I love that point that leaders change over time. So org psychology usually suggests that personality assessments are only valid for 3 years because people's personalities change based on life experiences, training, leadership experiences. So that really resonates with how people study conventional leaders as well. So I'm so glad you brought that up. That's great. Professor Doctor.
Sure. Thanks, Gina. Thanks for the question. I think this is a really important one. For me, the first two places I look when a new leader steps into that role and position, thinking about how they may make decisions, I look to two characteristics. First, their prior military experience. I'll talk about that in just a moment. The other is their prior political experience, right? Because I think that this fundamentally shapes the way that they view themselves in relationship to the status quo, and therefore potentially how they shape narratives in relation to the status quo, whether or not they come, for example, from a federal or national level political office, right, as opposed to maybe being a district or regional local leader, or from being from a fully marginalized, right, unrepresented group, is going to shape how they view themselves in relationship to the existing structures of power. It's going to shape the narratives they craft to mobilize persons to their cause, and likely the types of demands that they might make on the leaders, right, the stakeholders of that status quo. And so political experience, I think, can offer a useful initial sort of point of assessment or point of leverage for anticipating the upcoming trajectory of a given insurgent, militant, terrorist movement. On the military experience side, as you know, we just published a study about this exact topic in terrorism and political violence. I think we can actually make that available in the chat for those of you who are interested in that. Gina, our team, you and I, and our esteemed colleague Sam Hunter, find that when militant groups are led by leaders with prior military experiences, whether that be through a state military or formally through another militant group, that their groups tend to engage in terrorist activity more than twice as often in terms of frequency, and their lethality actually increases, right, at a similar rate. What's also interesting about this study and what we found in the course of our work is that if we actually look under the hood, our research indicates that there are specific forms of leader military experience as they relate to terrorist activity at the group level in different ways. For example, combat experience, actual identified experience on the ground, more informal, right, tends to translate to much higher levels of terrorist activity once those persons step into a leadership role. But inversely, groups that are led by leaders who strictly have military training, right, formalized military training, that prior experience can actually have a more tempering effect for the groups where that background is actually associated with lower predicted levels of terrorism related fatalities. And I think raises an important point that, yes, something like military experience, something like political experience, or other forms of biodata are important, but it's also equally important that we not treat these experiences in some sort of monolithic sense, right, catch-all category, but do the work to investigate the mechanisms to understand why different types of these experiences matter, and in what way and how they shape the specific outcomes that are of interest for us. Military experience, political experiences, these are all good places to start, but they're certainly not the only leadership characteristics that matter. Kinship networks, as we discussed, I think matter. Thinking about leaders' pathways, their own professional development and leadership development, who has played a role in bringing them up as a leader? What clerics, what other militant commanders have been part of that support structure? And that may also offer some insight into how they view themselves as leaders when they step into that role. Overall, I just think there's a lot of room here to better understand how leadership characteristics and experiences shape militant groups' trajectories, and really how those combined profiles can be used as instruments to better understand and even anticipate these movements and groups that we study.
Thank you. Dr. Whiteside.
I'll keep it short because I think, there are a lot of good ideas that have been presented, and I'll tie into the last thing that Austin said, which is pathways. I think, when we think about our own political leadership, and I think that's, again, political versus military leadership. These are militant groups, but they're very political, and in some cases they decide to have political leaders. I think, when we think about our political leaders, we wonder how, where did they come from? What's their past experience? Were they a governor of a state? Were they, a representative? And what's their actual pathway? I'm always fascinated by the networks of Islamic State and how those networks keep repeating and replicating and manifesting in the future, which the project I'm studying now, the leadership of the early Islamic State, al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2006, really reappears again in 2014 and 15 for a variety of reasons at the very top. But those networks and who they were associated with were understood by the American military, who interrogated all of those people and had built the networks because they were so network focused. And yet it doesn't seem to impact other areas of analysis or policy. And that's, I think, paying attention to the networks, but who these people are, who they grew up with, who they're mentored by, and then how that sets them up for the future is pretty critical.
That's great. I love as a psychologist, love the pathway remark as well. I want to make sure I give these incredibly bright audience members a chance to get their questions answered. We're going to get through as many as we can, but ones we don't get to, we will email them to the panelists to see if we can get them to answer in some other way. But this first question, I think, is really related to Dr. Bacon's discussion of it really depends on the type of outcome you're thinking about when you talk about different leadership styles or different models. And so this question comes from the brilliant Jeff Selden, and he asked the question of what connections do you see between different leadership styles or models and the emphasis on carrying out external attacks on more regional or localized campaigns? So is there anything when you think about that as a dependent variable or an outcome that you're interested in your different typologies of leaders?
I think that's a really interesting question. And the two things that occur to me initially is, of course, the main kind of leaders we associate that shift to are fixers or visionaries. But one of the things that we found when we were looking in particular at fixers is at the end of it, we wondered if there wasn't sort of a further breakdown of that kind of leader that we should do, because there's just the range of changes that leaders undertook as that type just varied so widely. And if there isn't something sort of subtypes that go along with that, because it could be everything from sort of starting a political party to becoming a more regional or international organization. So I think that was sort of a core finding that we asked ourselves, should we look at more in the future? And then, of course, I think the main thing that's associated with is a visionary. It's associated with a leader who is trying to make this sort of broader appeal and to change the group in this dynamic way, usually to revitalize it. I mean, visionaries almost always came because they were seeking revitalization. So that would be kind of the main type that we saw undertaking that, because usually to make that kind of expansion, it requires both changes, right? Unless it's just sort of a slight regionalization. The broader kinds of regionalization or internationalization required a visionary type leader, but that backfired as often as it worked, because you are also diluting the sort of why people join the organization. That's maybe not what you're pursuing anymore. Maybe you're not attracting from your core constituency when you do that. So I think this really gets at that really stark sort of two poles of outcomes that we saw with visionaries.
Yeah, that's great. And I think related to that, one of the questions we had in our request for proposals this year for Insight was about what would be the leader's role, but also the organization in changing from a local insurgency to a more globally focused group. So a change in their attack strategies. We did not get a proposal on that this year. So if you are interested in this type of scholarship and would like to do that, there is a US government end user who would be very eager to fund that work. So hopefully we'll get one eventually. I did want to ask the next one to Craig Whiteside. So he had some really great graphs of ISIS's sharp decline over time. And the question that we have from the audience, this is an anonymous attendee, is what action specifically by the coalition might cause it to increase? So if we think ISIS is going down, is there anything that the coalition might do that would actually backfire and make them become more active or more lethal? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question, but I might turn it on its head, or at least on its side a little bit. First, as I like to do, is to look back and say, well, what caused this decline? The Obama administration had had a policy decision to make about the Islamic State Caliphate when it was announced in 2014, and that was, what do we do about it? Do we ignore it? Will it go away on its own? They thought they called them the Taliban at first because of a misunderstanding of the state structure, the state focused, and the idea of on the genocidal ideology that they have. So they then changed policy and went towards reducing the caliphate, and that's had an exceptional impact on not just the core, but also some of the affiliates, not all, as we're seeing in Africa, but it is creating a localized dynamic and a possible detachment and vulnerability link between the central and the affiliates that could be exploited, much as they have been with certain Syrian franchises that have split off from IS. It's only fractured to date. The second thing is making sure we understand what we did that was successful, like the counter-ISIL campaign very broadly, and what wasn't, really efforts prior to that during the surge period, and certain legends that we've kind of told ourselves about how successful that was, and yet in the long term we were right back there. And then third and finally, I really don't think that it's anything that the United States does or doesn't do that's going to change the trajectory that we see currently. To me, it will be some other exogenous or really regional dynamic that will set that off. And to me, the number one possibility is an Iranian-Israeli conflict that will destabilize Syria, to be sure, but Lebanon, the West Bank, Gaza, and maybe even further, poison relations with Jordan, et cetera, upset diplomatic efforts that have been going on for the last 4 years. And I say that because I think, it was getting close, and there's lots of indicators that there's, a shadow war going on between Israel and Syria, Iran in Syria. And if that gets out of control, that would not be within U.S. interest for stability in the region, and it would probably change that trajectory.
Yeah, especially the propaganda coming out of that. That's great. That's a really good insight, Craig. The next question is for Dr. Abbas, and especially with his historical perspective of now that America has left the AFPAC or Afghanistan region, but the question is, what is the AFPAC region doing to stem recruitment into these new organizations? And how does that compare to 10 years ago when the coalition was there in our stemming of recruitment activities? Dr. Abbas, you're on mute. Sorry. I want to make sure we hear you.
My apologies. My understanding is that the overall recruitment patterns have changed in South Asia. There's these militant groups, by and large, have lesser number of people who are really their loyal core, at least in Pakistan. In Afghanistan, I think there's a very important question which may sound very basic, but I think that's a big puzzle. The way we had confused insurgency and terrorism. And that remains a big issue, because there was a big debate in US, the military side, intelligence side as well. For the last 20 years, we kept on thinking, what's the Taliban number? 20,000, 30,000, 40,000? It turns out that it is in millions, because we were looking at a different way in which we look at the recruitment, and we confused in between insurgency and terrorism as well. I know this is making a controversial point, but I think this is very much relevant to South Asia today. TTP also, so long as they are able to gain some ethnic support, tribal support, and there are some grievances which are political or historical, that is more a sign of an insurgency. And they have a different way they recruit, and it is much easier to recruit people in insurgency than in terrorism. In terrorism, there are more specific goals, there are more organizational things. I'm generalizing, of course, but that is one thing I want to mention. The second thing is, which is relevant for other places as well, but South Asia especially, a very, very little investment in counter narratives or counter extremism. That is the way to stem the tide. Many people will tell you that in some of the terrorist groups are weakened, which is true, but radicalization in society has increased in comparison. So those people who have radicalized on issues of blasphemy, for example, in Pakistan, you'll not be able to say that they have joined a terrorist group per se. But because of the radicalization in society on certain religious issues, at a critical moment, they can get involved in terror and violence. So how do we quantify that? So these things, insurgency, terrorism, radicalization trends, those who are at the helm of affairs, those who are responsible for countering these, have to be very, very clear on these issues. And in South Asia, I see there's still a confusion on this issue. In India as well, last point. In India, which is not often covered in media by and large, because it is in transition, the national kind of political polarization that has happened in India, and what is happening to minorities with Muslim groups and Christian groups and many other groups as well in certain areas, not all across India. That, to me, my biggest concern is any religious extremist group from the Islamic side will be able to recruit quite easily. The Muslims in India have not shown that path, that's the path they would take. I'm not talking about Kashmir, which is a different issue, but by and large in India. But if that is not taken care of from within the Muslim societies in India, which is a large 220 to 230 million people, then, and if they continue to feel alienated and that the state is not supporting them, it will be very easy for any regional country to trigger trouble, or indigenously some group will come out. We had seen previously this had happened, but India had done well in pushing that out of the game. Now I see that in coming years, 5 to 7 years, 3 to 5 years, that can be a big challenge. So that's the kind of AFPAC picture that I see. And I'm not seeing whether from government of India or from Pakistan. Afghanistan is a slightly different case, but in Bangladesh also, it is the way the government, which is a democratically elected government, but the way they have gone after their opposition parties, which is a religious party, declaring them a terrorist, that has created a new challenge, which is forcing some of the political opponents to say, if you keep on calling people terrorists, they ultimately say, okay, this is a title that has been given to me. Okay, let me turn out to be a terrorist, even if they are kind of political extremists, which is different category than terrorists. Thank you.
No, that's really insightful. So I think I want to make sure we get. I'm combining two questions for Austin. So he's got a few questions about Africa. So Austin, what's the impact of Russia and China in Africa on these groups that you're studying? And relatedly, is there a strong presence of foreign fighters in any of the groups you're studying? Is there a penchant for accepting them into the ranks, or are they more homogenous in their makeup?
Thanks, Gina. Two very good questions. I'll start with the foreign fighter question and then come back to the China and Russia issue. For foreign fighters first, yes, present in many groups on the continent and intentionally recruited by their leadership. Most of these come from regional neighboring states. Partly from a feasibility aspect. Some of it has to do with leveraging kinship networks that extend beyond sort of present political boundaries. In terms of the extent of their presence, the majority of these are recruited more at the rank and file level and would represent a minority of the force for these different groups. There are a couple of exceptions. I think about the group in northern Mozambique being led, at least spiritually and doctrinally, by a Tanzanian national. That's an exception, though, to the rule, in that for the most part, these groups are led by leaders from communities that they're primarily operating in, who make strategic decisions to bring in and actively recruit foreigners, in part to boost their ranks, right, and their operational viability, at least in the short term. As Tricia and I think many others on this call know, foreign fighters are not necessarily always a force multiplier, right? They can have short and long-term negative effects on the trajectory viability of the groups that bring them in. So this is a measured risk and strategic trade-off that local leaders have to weigh when they think about their intentional recruitment profiles. As it relates to China and Russia, I would say that they have similar effects through very different mechanisms. The perpetuation of weak governance, destabilization, and extraction of resources. All of those things can contribute to providing and sort of exacerbating permissive conditions for these groups to thrive. I think one of the questions mentioned BRI, right? Belt and Road Initiative through China. And if you look at the terms of those deals, or at least we make an assessment based on what we believe about the terms of those deals, those are highly extractive with high rates, right? That has lent itself to default, right? An exacerbation of actually a weak financial and economic position. This is the exact material that local leaders, militants, aspiring entrepreneurs can use to tell compelling and convincing narratives of why change is needed and mobilize more recruits to their cause. It doesn't help that many of these arrangements through the Belt and Road Initiative also come with very little fine print on human rights practices on the ground, which represent another form of often of grievances that can inflate the ranks of these violent Islamist groups in different areas of the continent. As it relates to Russia, they also have a very extractive posture to their foreign policy approach to the African continent and have an additional layer of destabilization through their use and instrumentalization of the Wagner Group, creating not just a permissive environment for radical violence, but actually contributing to violence on the ground.
Right. So we have a little time left. And so what I'm going to ask the panelists to do, this is very exciting. In under 1 minute, I would like each of you to share what you hope one takeaway from this event will be for these hundreds of individuals who have dialed in and spent their hour and a half with us, which is just incredible. I mean, it shows how important this topic is. And so what I'd like to do is start with Craig, and then go to Austin, and then go to Trisha, and then go to Hassan for the reverse order from the beginning. So Craig doesn't always have to be at the end. So we'll, timer's on, Craig. So if you bust a minute, I'm just going to mute you, but I will go first to Dr. Whiteside. Go for it, Craig.
Thank you, Gina. As a war college professor, I'll start and end with theorists, but I won't name them for you. One that our industrial leadership targeting, which took 2 to 3 years in the early phases of what you might call the GWAT. It took 2 to 3 years for it to excel to the industrial, really exquisite tactic that we use today. But that gave our opponents an opportunity to think about how to institutionalize leadership and leadership succession, particularly for Islamic State, and I think others are looking at that. And that's, of course, the theorist who talks about war or warfare as, this engagement between two or more thinking entities that are trying to counter each other. And that's what we see, I think, a theme throughout all of our discussion points. They learned how to transition charismatic posthumously from the founder, and they learned how to protect leaders long enough and create formal advisory councils that could, help insulate leaders and keep them alive as long as possible. And again, I'll end with, that's what we've learned about warfare since Thucydides. It's this give and take nature, back and forth, and we need to make sure we understand or empathize that our opponents and adversaries are learning and thinking about a lot of the same things that everyone here is talking about.
Austin, you didn't listen to the order.
Yeah, thanks, Gina.
Next is Austin, Doctor.
Sure. Thanks. In under a minute, 2 things. First is an encouragement not to take our eye off the ball. The threat presented by the global jihadist enterprise is still real and present. It's often framed, or increasingly I hear the problem set framed as a pivot towards great power competition. I'd like to go between the horns of that dilemma, right, and suggest that the broader global security environment is not substituting one threat for another. Rather, we are seeing the layering of multiple complex threat spaces simultaneously to include the sustained presence and actually evolving and morphing nature of transnational and domestic terrorism. The second is that, and I'm preaching to the choir here, right, is that leadership matters, and that a focus from an analytic standpoint and from in terms of applied, both basic and applied research, an analytic focus on jihadist leaders, both global and local, can offer an effective and a highly efficient vantage point or point of leverage for understanding and anticipating these violent threats and trends.
I think those are all really great points that were made already. I think the only thing I would add to this is I think we're at an inflection point. We spent 20 some years sort of assessing the effects of leadership decapitation after it was undertaken. And I think that the scholars here today are sort of turning over a new leaf, and Gina's been at this for a while, of looking more closely at the leaders themselves and trying to understand leaders as, you know, their role in these organizations, you know, the impact of their characteristics on the organizations that they lead. And so I think that it's sort of a call for more examination of leadership at this point, so that going forward, there's a more sort of fulsome understanding of that as we work in an environment much more constrained in terms of resources for counterterrorism.
Thank you so much. Inspired by these excellent comments and ideas, I'm thinking of one idea which I'm speculating more so, but based on my calculated guess, which is that maybe this age of small militant groups is upon us, where we will not exactly know the leaders, unlike like 10 years ago, Bin Laden, or 15 years ago, Bin Laden, big leader, Baghdadi. Today, if someone asks who's the leader of al-Qaeda or who's the leader of ISIS or ISK, at a global level, people will not be able to answer these big names. So maybe it is, we'll see more of smaller groups benefiting from social media and other electronic platforms to create interest for short time, and then they will transition and go elsewhere, which will make them far more harder to follow and tackle. That's a challenge that is coming towards us, I think. Thank you.
All right, that was excellent use of time, everyone. Thank you so much. And I think we have a possible special issue on our hands with these kinds of insights, and I'm very excited to have heard from all of you. There are so many great questions in the chat. So again, to follow up with these, we're going to give them to the panelists and try to be able to get them to collate and respond to some of these questions for you, especially for people that gave their name, which was helpful. The other piece is we will have this recording on the Program on Extremism's website shortly after this, and you'll be able to see it. You'll also see it on Insight social media. So if you follow us on Twitter, you'll be able to see links and a really great live tweet of all of these professionals and their expert opinion. But for now, thank you for Department of Homeland Security sponsoring this work today, even though none of the opinions of the panelists are attributed to Department of Homeland Security, but we do want to thank them for the resources to be able to have events like this and gather together. So with that, thanks for your time, and we will see you soon.